Picture this. It's January 10th, 49th BCE. A single man stands at the edge of a small river in northern Italy, staring across waters that might as well be the gates of hell. Behind him march 5,000 battle-hardened veterans, their loyalty absolute, their discipline legendary. Ahead lies Rome, not just the city, but an empire that spans from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. The river is called the Rubicon. The man is Gaius Julius Caesar, and with one decision, one step forward, he will plunge the Roman world into a civil war so devastating that it will end the Republic forever, and birth an empire that will dominate the known world for over 1,000 years. But this isn't just Caesar's story. On the other side of this conflict stands Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, the conqueror of the East, the man who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and brought 3 continents under Roman rule. 2 titans of their age, once allies, now locked in a struggle that will determine whether Rome remains a republic or becomes something entirely different. The question that echoes across 25 centuries is this: was this war inevitable? Or could 2 of history's greatest leaders have found another way? Today we dive deep into the greatest civil war of the ancient world, a conflict that changed everything. To understand how Rome reached this breaking point, we must first understand what Rome was in the 1st century before Christ. This wasn't the marble empire of later centuries, ruled by purple-clad emperors from golden palaces. This was the Roman Republic, a system of government that had lasted nearly 500 years, built on the revolutionary idea that no single man should hold ultimate power. The heart of Roman governance beat in the Forum Romanum, where marble columns rose toward the sky like ancient trees, their shadows falling across the sacred stones where senators debated the fate of millions. Here, 2 consuls shared executive power for exactly 1 year before stepping down. Here, the Senate, comprised of former magistrates who had proven their worth, guided policy through wisdom earned in decades of service. And here, the tribunes of the plebs could veto any action that threatened the common people's rights. It was ingenious, really. Power was divided, rotated, checked, and balanced. The Romans had learned from watching Greek city-states tear themselves apart under tyranny. They had seen what happened when one man accumulated too much authority. Their ancestors had expelled the last king in 509 BCE, and they swore it would never happen again. But by the 1st century BCE, cracks were showing in this beautiful system. Rome had grown too successful. What started as a collection of 7 hills beside the Tiber River had become master of the Mediterranean world. Roman legions had crushed Carthage, conquered Greece, and subdued Gaul. Roman merchants traded in silk from China and spices from India. Roman engineers built roads that would last millennia and aqueducts that still carry water today. Success, however, brought problems the founders never anticipated. First, there was the wealth. Mountains of gold and silver flowed into Rome from conquered territories. Senators who once lived modestly now owned estates worked by thousands of slaves. The gap between rich and poor became a chasm. Small farmers, the backbone of the Roman army, lost their land to massive slave-worked plantations called latifundia. Second, there was the military reality. Rome's armies were no longer citizen soldiers serving for a season before returning to their farms. They were professional legions serving for decades under commanders who fed them, paid them, and promised them land upon retirement. A general who could deliver wealth and victory commanded loyalty that sometimes exceeded loyalty to Rome itself. Third, there was the sheer scale of empire. Governing territories from the Atlantic to the Euphrates required extraordinary individuals with extraordinary powers. Traditional Roman magistrates, limited to 1-year terms within the sacred boundary of the city, couldn't handle multi-year campaigns across continents. The Republic had to bend its own rules, creating special commands that concentrated unprecedented authority in single hands. Into this volatile mix stepped a generation of Romans unlike any before them. There was Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Roman history, who made his fortune buying burning buildings at bargain prices, then sending his private fire brigade to extinguish the flames. His wealth was so legendary that when asked how much money a man needed to be considered rich, he replied, "Enough to maintain a legion." There was Pompey the Great, who earned his first triumph before he was legally old enough to serve in the Senate. By age 45, he had conquered more territory than any Roman before him, clearing the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months and reorganizing the entire Eastern Mediterranean. And there was Julius Caesar, whose family claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, a man of such ambition and talent that his very name would become synonymous with absolute power in a dozen languages. These 3 men would form an alliance so secret that most Romans didn't know it existed, yet so powerful that it effectively controlled the Republic. History calls it the First Triumvirate, though the Romans themselves had no name for it. It was simply 3 friends dividing the world among themselves, but friendship among giants rarely lasts when the stakes are absolute power. The Roman people of this era lived in a city of perhaps 1 million souls, making it the largest urban center in human history up to that point. Most crowded into multi-story apartment buildings called insulae, structures so poorly built that collapse was a constant fear. The wealthy occupied sprawling villas with gardens, fountains, and libraries, while the poor survived on free grain distributions and the spectacular entertainment of the games. Roman society was built on honor, duty, and competition. Every aristocrat sought glory, gloria, the immortal fame that came from serving Rome in war and peace. They competed fiercely for offices, military commands, and the right to celebrate triumphs. This competition drove Rome's expansion and excellence, but it also created rivalry that could turn deadly when traditional limits no longer held. The Romans worshipped their ancestors and their gods with equal devotion. They believed the gods had chosen Rome for greatness, but only if Romans maintained their virtue and honored the sacred customs of their forefathers. Traditional Romans looked with growing alarm at the luxury, the foreign influences, and the breakdown of ancient customs that success had brought. Women in Roman society occupied a unique position compared to their Greek counterparts. While they couldn't vote or hold office, wealthy Roman women owned property, ran businesses, and wielded significant behind-the-scenes political influence. Some, like Caesar's daughter Julia, became crucial political pawns whose marriages could seal alliances or whose deaths could shatter them. The Roman military machine was the most efficient killing force the ancient world had ever seen. A Roman legion numbered about 5,000 men, organized into centuries of 80 soldiers each. They fought with short swords called gladi, perfect for close combat, and carried large rectangular shields that could form an impenetrable wall. Their engineering skills were as feared as their fighting prowess. Romans could build a fortified camp every single night on the march, and their siege weapons could reduce any city to rubble. But perhaps most importantly, Roman soldiers swore an oath, the sacramentum militia, that bound them to their commander until death or discharge. This oath created a bond stronger than family, forged in shared danger and sealed with shared victory. It was this loyalty that made Roman armies invincible. It was also this loyalty that would tear the Republic apart. As our story begins, Rome stood at the pinnacle of ancient power, master of the known world, seemingly invincible. Yet beneath the marble facades and golden eagles, forces were building that would soon unleash a storm of civil war unlike anything the world had ever seen. The stage was set. The players were taking their positions, and the greatest political drama in ancient history was about to begin. The alliance that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic began not with grand declarations or signed treaties, but with a secret meeting in 60 BCE that changed the course of history. 3 men, each holding pieces of the puzzle that was Roman power, decided to combine their strengths rather than compete against each other. Pompey the Great had just returned from his eastern campaigns, having reorganized the entire region from the Black Sea to the Red Sea. He had added more territory to Rome than any general in history, filling the treasury with unimaginable wealth. Yet the Senate, jealous of his success and fearful of his power, blocked his every move. They refused to ratify his eastern settlements and denied land grants for his veterans. Pompey, for all his military genius, found himself politically isolated. Marcus Crassus controlled more wealth than some provinces, but wealth without military glory meant little in Rome. He had helped suppress Spartacus's slave rebellion, but Pompey had stolen much of the credit. Now approaching 60, Crassus burned with the desire to match his partner's military achievements and prove himself Rome's greatest general. Julius Caesar faced a different problem. Brilliant, charismatic, and politically gifted, he was also deeply in debt. His lavish spending on games and public works had won him popularity but emptied his coffers. Worse, his enemies in the Senate were preparing to prosecute him the moment he left office, when his immunity as a magistrate would expire. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Pompey would get his eastern settlements ratified and land for his veterans. Crassus would receive a military command in Syria, where he could win glory fighting the Parthians. Caesar would get the consulship, followed by a lucrative provincial command in Gaul. Each man would use his influence to secure what the others needed. To seal the alliance, Caesar offered his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey, despite the 30-year age gap. Politics in Rome was intensely personal, and family bonds could trump all other considerations. Julia was beautiful, intelligent, and devoted to her father. The marriage, against all expectations, became a genuine love match that held the triumvirate together for years. Caesar's year as consul in 59 BCE revealed both his political genius and his willingness to break with tradition when it suited his purposes. When his fellow consul Bibulus tried to block his legislation, Caesar had him physically removed from the forum. When the Senate refused to cooperate, Caesar took his proposals directly to the popular assemblies. Romans began joking that it was the consulship of Julius and Caesar rather than Caesar and Bibulus. The legislation Caesar pushed through was revolutionary. Pompey's veterans received their promised lands. Crassus got favorable tax arrangements for his business interests. And Caesar secured for himself an unprecedented 5-year command in Gaul. Enough time to conquer new territories, enrich himself and his soldiers, and build the military reputation he needed to compete with his partners. But even as the triumvirate achieved its immediate goals, the seeds of its destruction were already sprouting. Traditional republicans, led by men like Cato the Younger, watched with growing alarm as constitutional norms crumbled. Cato, a man of such rigid integrity that he walked barefoot through Rome's streets and wore black togas to protest moral decay, became the conscience of the old republic. He organized opposition to the triumvirs at every turn, using procedural delays and moral arguments to slow their advance. Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, found himself caught between pragmatism and principle. He had exposed the Catiline conspiracy and saved Rome from revolution. But now he watched helplessly as the constitution he had defended was systematically undermined. His letters from this period reveal a man torn between his love of the Republic and his recognition that power had shifted irrevocably. Meanwhile, Caesar marched north to Gaul with 4 legions and unlimited ambition. What followed would be 8 years of some of the most brilliant military campaigns in history. Caesar conquered tribe after tribe, pushing Roman power to the Rhine and across the Channel to Britain. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, written in precise third-person prose, became required reading for anyone seeking to understand military strategy and political propaganda. The wealth Caesar extracted from Gaul was staggering. Gold and silver flowed south in wagon trains that stretched for miles. Hundreds of thousands of Celtic warriors were sold into slavery, generating profits that dwarfed even Crassus's fortune. Caesar used this wealth strategically, sending money to friends in Rome, funding public works, and ensuring his soldiers received bonuses that guaranteed their absolute loyalty. But Caesar's greatest achievement in Gaul wasn't military. It was transforming his legions into an extension of his own will. These weren't just Roman soldiers. They were Caesar's men. They had marched with him through the forests of Germania, fought beside him on the beaches of Britain, and shared the dangers and glories of unprecedented conquests. Their loyalty ran deeper than their oath to Rome. As Caesar built his legend in the north, cracks appeared in the triumvirate. The marriage between Pompey and Julia had brought genuine happiness to both, but it also highlighted the growing distance between Pompey and Caesar. Pompey, now in his 50s, was settling into the role of Rome's elder statesman. He built a magnificent theater complex in the Campus Martius and enjoyed his position as Rome's most celebrated general. Caesar, 20 years younger and driven by boundless ambition, sent regular reports of his victories that reminded everyone of Pompey's advancing age. Each triumph in Gaul was implicitly a challenge to Pompey's supremacy. The student was surpassing the master, and both men knew it. The first crack in their alliance came in 56 BCE, when political pressure in Rome threatened to recall Caesar from Gaul prematurely. The three partners met secretly in Lucca, a small town in northern Italy, to renew their agreement. Caesar would keep Gaul for another 5 years. Pompey and Crassus would serve as consuls together, then take lucrative provincial commands of their own. But this second arrangement contained the seeds of disaster. Crassus, desperate to match his partner's military achievements, chose Syria and immediately began planning an invasion of Parthia, Rome's greatest rival in the east. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. In 53 BCE, Crassus led 7 legions across the Euphrates into the Parthian desert. What happened next would echo through Roman nightmares for generations. At Carrhae, the Parthians destroyed Crassus's army using tactics the Romans had never encountered. Mounted archers circled the legions like wolves around a wounded elk, shooting clouds of arrows while staying beyond the reach of Roman swords. Crassus himself died in the desert, his head reportedly cut off and used as a prop in a Parthian theatrical performance. 20,000 Romans died with him. 10,000 were captured and marched to the edges of the known world, never to return. The golden eagles of 7 legions, the sacred standards that embodied Rome's honor, fell into barbarian hands. The news of Carrhae reached Rome like a thunderclap. The richest man in the world was dead. A third of the triumvirate was gone, and suddenly, the careful balance that had kept Caesar and Pompey as allies rather than rivals had shifted dramatically. Even worse for the remaining partners, Julia died in childbirth later that same year. The marriage that had bound Caesar and Pompey as family was over. The woman who had managed to love both her husband and her father despite their growing rivalry was gone. With her death, the last personal bond holding the triumvirate together snapped like an overstretched rope. Pompey, now alone at the head of Roman politics, began to see Caesar not as a partner but as a threat. Reports from Gaul described legions whose loyalty to their commander exceeded their loyalty to Rome. Caesar's agents in the city distributed gold with a generosity that bought influence throughout Roman society. His letters spoke of his desire to return to Rome and seek a second consulship, which would give him the immunity he needed to avoid prosecution. But Pompey and the Senate had no intention of allowing Caesar to return as anything other than a private citizen, vulnerable to his enemies and stripped of his protective legions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Rome, but what Rome would become. As 50 BCE dawned, 2 of the greatest generals in Roman history faced each other across an increasingly unbridgeable divide. Each commanded legions whose loyalty was absolute. Each possessed wealth that could buy allies throughout the Mediterranean world. Each had achieved victories that would echo through history. But Rome, as they both knew, was too small for both of them. The question was no longer whether they would fight, but when and where the first blow would fall. The answer would come soon enough at a small river in northern Italy that most Romans had never heard of. A river called the Rubicon. The final act of the Roman Republic began not with armies clashing on ancient battlefields, but with words spoken in marble halls where echoes seemed to carry the weight of 5 centuries of Roman law. December 50th, BCE. The Senate House buzzed with tension as senators debated Caesar's fate. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, stood before the assembled fathers of Rome with a proposal that seemed reasonable enough. Both Caesar and Pompey should simultaneously resign their commands and return to private life. It was a face-saving compromise that acknowledged both men's achievements while preventing civil war. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the votes. 370 senators supported the proposal. Only 22 opposed it. The message was clear. Rome's governing body wanted peace, not war. But Pompey was no longer listening to the Senate's voice. In the days that followed, he met privately with Caesar's enemies, men like Cato the Younger and the consul Marcellus. They painted vivid pictures of what Caesar's return would mean. The end of traditional Roman government, the transformation of the Republic into a personal kingdom, the reduction of the Senate to a powerless advisory body. Pompey, who had spent his entire adult life accumulating unprecedented powers, now cast himself as the defender of constitutional government. It was an irony that escaped no one, yet it gave moral weight to what was essentially a struggle for supremacy between 2 ambitious men. The turning point came when the new consuls took office in January 49 BCE. They brought with them the Senate's final ultimatum. Caesar must dismiss his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen by a specified date, or be declared an enemy of the state. Mark Antony rose again in the Senate, this time to read Caesar's response. The letter was a masterpiece of political theater, carefully crafted to appeal to different audiences. To the Senate, Caesar listed his services to Rome, the conquest of Gaul, the extension of Roman power to the Atlantic and the North Sea, the hundreds of thousands of barbarians killed or captured, the immense wealth added to the Roman treasury. He asked only for the same consideration granted to Pompey, the right to stand for consul while maintaining his command. To the Roman people, Caesar's message was even more pointed. He reminded them of the games he had funded, the buildings he had constructed, the debt relief he had provided. He spoke of his soldiers' loyalty and his own devotion to Roman glory. Most subtly, he positioned himself as the champion of popular rights against a senatorial oligarchy that cared more about preserving its privileges than serving Rome's interests. But the Senate's patience was exhausted. When Mark Antony attempted to veto the declaration of martial law, he and his colleague Cassius were physically threatened and forced to flee Rome in a cart, disguised as slaves. It was a scene calculated to provide Caesar with the propaganda victory he needed. The sacred persons of tribunes of the people, inviolate by Roman law, had been violated by Caesar's enemies. Now Caesar could claim he was not rebelling against Rome, but defending Roman law and custom against those who would break them. News of the tribune's flight reached Caesar at Ravenna, his winter headquarters in northern Italy. History has preserved the moment with crystal clarity. Caesar was attending gladiatorial games when the messenger arrived. He watched the contests continue, calmly discussed ordinary business with his staff, and dined with friends as if nothing had changed. But inside his mind, Caesar was calculating odds that would have impressed a professional gambler. He had with him only the 13th Legion, perhaps 5,000 men. In Spain, Pompey commanded 7 legions. In Italy, Pompey could potentially raise many more. The smart money said Caesar should negotiate, compromise, accept exile rather than face impossible odds. Caesar had never been smart money's favorite. Late that night, Caesar made his decision. He would not abandon his soldiers who had followed him for 8 years through the forests of Gaul and across the Channel to Britain. He would not submit to prosecution by men whose own crimes exceeded anything he was accused of. Most importantly, he would not allow Rome's future to be determined by fear rather than by the will of the Roman people. The next morning, January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar ordered the 13th Legion to break camp and march south. Their destination, a small river that marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy proper. The river was called the Rubicon. Roman law was absolutely clear on this point. No general could bring armed forces across the Rubicon without senatorial permission. To do so was to commit treason, the penalty for which was death. For over 4 centuries, this boundary had been sacred, a line no Roman commander dared cross with hostile intent. Caesar reached the Rubicon as darkness fell. He stood on the northern bank with his closest friends and advisors, staring across waters that looked black in the fading light. Across that river lay everything he had worked for his entire life. Rome, power, immortal glory. But crossing also meant civil war, the deaths of thousands of Romans, and the possible destruction of the Republic itself. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar hesitated at the water's edge. He understood the magnitude of what he was about to do. "We can still go back," he told his companions. "But once we cross this river, everything will be decided by the sword." Then Caesar spoke the words that would echo through 20 centuries of human history. "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. The 13th Legion crossed the Rubicon in the pre-dawn darkness, their hobnailed sandals splashing through the shallow water. With that crossing, the Roman Republic entered its death throes, but Caesar's gamble appeared hopeless. He commanded perhaps 5,000 men against an empire of 60 million. Pompey's forces outnumbered his by at least 4 to 1. Every rational analysis suggested Caesar had just committed elaborate suicide. What Caesar understood, however, was that numbers don't always determine victory. He had psychological advantages that couldn't be counted on a quartermaster's rolls. His soldiers were veterans of 8 years of continuous warfare, men who had never known defeat under his command. They were bound to him by ties stronger than law or tradition. They were bound by shared danger, shared victory, and shared wealth. More importantly, Caesar understood that his enemy's apparent strength masked serious weaknesses. Pompey's legions in Spain were experienced, but they were far from Italy. The forces Pompey could raise in Italy were largely untested. Many were recent recruits who had never seen serious combat. Most critically, Caesar understood Roman psychology better than his enemies did. Romans respected strength, but they despised unprovoked aggression. If Caesar could present himself as the wronged party defending Roman law against those who would break it, he could win the propaganda war that often mattered more than battlefield victories. Caesar's first moves after crossing the Rubicon revealed the strategic genius that had conquered Gaul. Instead of marching directly on Rome, he moved against Pompey's scattered forces in northern Italy. His targets were chosen for maximum psychological impact. Cities that had benefited from his generosity during his consulship, regions where his veterans had settled, areas where his reputation for clemency was well known. The results exceeded even Caesar's expectations. Town after town opened its gates without resistance. Pompey's hastily assembled forces melted away rather than fight Caesar's veterans. Most shocking of all, entire legions defected to Caesar's cause, their soldiers claiming they had been misled about Caesar's intentions. At Corfinium, Caesar achieved a propaganda victory that resonated throughout the Roman world. When Pompey's lieutenant Domitius was captured with his entire force, Caesar not only spared his life but released him without ransom. It was an unprecedented display of clemency that made Caesar appear magnanimous while highlighting his enemy's desperation. "I want to be different," Caesar told his staff. I want to win through mercy and generosity rather than cruelty and fear. It was both genuine policy and brilliant propaganda. Caesar was staking out the moral high ground in a conflict that would be remembered for centuries. Meanwhile, Pompey found himself in an impossible position. His expected easy victory had turned into a rout. His Italian recruits were proving unreliable. His veteran legions in Spain might as well have been on the moon. Worst of all, his own reputation for invincibility was crumbling with each town that surrendered to Caesar without a fight. In council with his supporters, Pompey made a decision that would define the rest of the war. Rather than make a desperate stand in Italy with inferior forces, he would withdraw to the east, where his reputation was strongest and his resources most secure. Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt all remembered Pompey as their conqueror and organizer. There he could rebuild his strength and return to Italy with overwhelming force. It was strategically sound, but psychologically devastating. To ordinary Romans, it looked like Pompey was abandoning the city he claimed to be defending. Caesar's propaganda machine immediately seized on this apparent contradiction. How could Pompey be Rome's protector if he was fleeing from Rome? The evacuation of Rome by the established government was unprecedented in Roman history. Senators, magistrates, and their families streamed out of the city in what looked remarkably like panic. The treasury was emptied, important documents were destroyed, and contingency plans were made to burn the city's grain supplies rather than let them fall into Caesar's hands. But the most shocking moment came when Pompey himself left Rome. Standing on the steps of his magnificent theater complex, the building that symbolized his contributions to the city, Pompey looked back at the marble columns and bronze statues that commemorated his victories. According to witnesses, he spoke just 4 words: "I shall return victorious." Then Pompey the Great, conqueror of 3 continents, master of the Mediterranean, the man who had brought more territory under Roman rule than any general in history, walked away from Rome rather than fight for it. Caesar entered the city 60 days after crossing the Rubicon, moving faster than anyone thought possible. He had covered the length of Italy in 2 months, defeated or scattered every force sent against him, and accomplished what military experts declared impossible. He had conquered Italy with a single legion. But as Caesar stood in the Forum Romanum, surrounded by the marble monuments to Roman greatness, he understood that the hardest part lay ahead. He controlled Rome, but Pompey controlled the east. He commanded Italy, but his enemies commanded the sea. He had won the opening moves, but the game was far from over. And somewhere across the Adriatic in the camps of Greece, Pompey the Great was gathering an army that would test Caesar's genius to its absolute limits. The civil war that would determine the fate of the Western world had truly begun. Caesar's lightning conquest of Italy had stunned the Roman world, but seasoned observers understood that the real test lay ahead. Controlling Rome was one thing, controlling an empire was entirely different. And across the Mediterranean, Pompey was methodically assembling the most formidable force the ancient world had ever seen. From his headquarters in Thessalonica, Pompey drew on relationships built over 30 years of Eastern campaigns. Kings and princes who owed their thrones to his intervention now opened their treasuries. Cities that had prospered under his organization sent ships, supplies, and soldiers. The Parthian disaster that had killed Crassus actually worked in Pompey's favor, as Eastern rulers saw him as their only protection against future barbarian invasions. The numbers were staggering. By the spring of 48 BCE, Pompey commanded 11 legions, nearly 60,000 of the finest soldiers in the world. His cavalry, drawn from Galatian nobles and Thracian chieftains, numbered 7,000. His fleet of 500 ships controlled every sea lane in the Mediterranean. Most impressively, his treasury could sustain this massive force indefinitely, fed by the wealth of provinces that produced everything from Egyptian grain to Syrian silk. Caesar, trapped in Italy with perhaps 30,000 men, faced logistics that would have broken a lesser commander. Pompey's naval blockade meant no supplies could reach Italy by sea. The western provinces remained loyal to Pompey, cutting off resources from Spain and Africa. Most critically, Caesar's soldiers were starting to wonder if they had followed their commander into an impossible situation. But Caesar had not spent 8 years conquering Gaul without learning how to turn disadvantages into opportunities. If he couldn't match Pompey's resources, he would use speed and audacity to prevent Pompey from bringing those resources to bear effectively. First, Caesar secured his rear by dividing his forces in a way that violated every principle of military science. He sent his most trusted lieutenant, Mark Antony, to Gaul with orders to march the remaining legions to Italy as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, he dispatched other commanders to secure grain from Sardinia and Sicily, knowing that controlling Rome's food supply would be crucial for long-term success. Most audaciously, Caesar decided to carry the war to Pompey rather than wait for invasion. In December 49 BCE, despite winter storms that made sea travel suicidal, Caesar loaded 7 legions onto every available ship and sailed for Greece. It was exactly the kind of move that had made him famous, so risky that no one expected it, so bold that it caught his enemies completely off guard. The crossing nearly ended in disaster. Winter gales scattered Caesar's fleet across the Adriatic. Ships were wrecked on unfamiliar coasts. Thousands of soldiers were separated from their equipment and supplies. When Caesar finally assembled his forces on the Greek coast, he commanded barely 20,000 men, facing Pompey's 60,000 in unfamiliar territory with limited supplies. Any rational commander would have considered retreat. Caesar, as usual, chose to attack. The first engagement came at Dyrrhachium, a coastal fortress that controlled the main route between Greece and Italy. Caesar's assault was characteristically swift and violent, but for once, speed wasn't enough. Pompey had anticipated Caesar's move and prepared accordingly. The fortress walls were too strong, the defenders too numerous, and Caesar's men too exhausted from their harrowing sea crossing. For the first time in his career, Caesar suffered a clear defeat. His losses were severe, nearly 1,000 of his precious veterans killed or wounded. Worse, the defeat gave Pompey's eastern allies confidence that Caesar could be beaten. Recruiting increased throughout the region as local leaders sensed which way the wind was blowing. But Caesar's reaction to defeat revealed the qualities that made him truly dangerous. Instead of retreating to Italy or seeking negotiated peace, he withdrew inland toward Thessaly, drawing Pompey away from his secure coastal base. It was a calculated gamble. Caesar was trading tactical retreat for strategic opportunity, betting that he could find favorable ground for the decisive battle that would determine everything. Pompey, flushed with his first victory over Caesar, made the mistake that would define the rest of the war. Instead of maintaining his advantageous position and letting logistics destroy Caesar's army, he allowed himself to be drawn into pursuing his enemy inland. His advisors, particularly the influential Senator Cato, pressed him to end the war quickly and decisively. Caesar is a wounded animal now, they argued. Finish him before he can recover. It was exactly what Caesar was counting on. As the two armies maneuvered across the plains of Thessaly in the summer of 48 BCE, the fate of the Western world hung in the balance. Caesar's veterans, despite their recent defeat, maintained absolute confidence in their commander. They had followed him through 8 years of Gallic campaigns across the Rubicon and down the length of Italy. One setback wouldn't break their faith. Pompey's forces, while larger and better equipped, included many troops of questionable loyalty. Some were recent recruits from Italian cities that had surrendered to Caesar. Others were foreign auxiliaries fighting for pay rather than conviction. Most problematically, Pompey's officer corps included senators and aristocrats more interested in settling political scores than winning military victories. The cultural differences between the two armies were striking. Caesar's camps buzzed with the rough camaraderie of professional soldiers who had shared danger and glory. His officers were mostly men who had risen through merit, promoted for their courage and competence rather than their birth or connections. Pompey's camps, by contrast, resembled mobile cities of the Roman elite. Senators brought their personal slaves, their favorite chefs, and their libraries. They debated philosophy in silk pavilions and competed to host the most elaborate dinner parties. Some even brought their wives and mistresses to what they expected to be a brief, victorious campaign. "They're already dividing up the spoils," Caesar's scouts reported. "They argue about who will get which offices in Rome, which provinces will be assigned to whom. They act as if the war is already won." Caesar filed this information away with the cold calculation that marked all his strategic thinking. An army confident of victory could be more dangerous than a desperate one, but an army that took victory for granted could be shattered if that confidence proved misplaced. The decisive moment came in August 48 BCE, on the plains outside a small town called Pharsalus. Caesar had finally found the ground he wanted, open terrain that favored his experienced infantry over Pompey's superior cavalry, with secure flanks that prevented Pompey from using his numerical advantage effectively. But even Caesar's veterans felt doubt as they formed their battle lines that morning. Across the field, Pompey's army stretched as far as the eye could see, legion after legion of armored infantry, squadron after squadron of cavalry, the banners of a dozen nations fluttering in the morning breeze. "There are so many of them," one centurion muttered. Caesar heard the comment and turned to address not just that soldier, but the entire front rank within hearing distance. His voice carried the absolute confidence that had sustained them through years of impossible victories. "Yes, there are many of them," he said. "But they are Romans like us. They bleed like us. And when we break their line, they will run like every enemy we have ever faced. Today we fight not just for victory, but for the future of Rome itself, as if you're captivated by this clash between titans that would reshape the ancient world. Consider subscribing to join us for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped human civilization. Your support helps us bring these epic stories to life with the detail and depth they deserve. The pre-battle ritual unfolded with ceremonies that had remained unchanged for centuries. Priests examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, searching for signs of divine favor. Officers moved through the ranks, checking equipment and offering final words of encouragement. Veterans shared their rations with newer soldiers, a gesture that reinforced the bonds that made Roman armies nearly invincible. But this battle would be different from all others. These weren't Romans fighting barbarians or foreigners. These were Romans fighting Romans, legions that had once fought side by side under the same eagles, now preparing to spill each other's blood on Greek soil. Pompey's battle plan reflected both his strengths and his caution. He positioned his most reliable troops, the veteran legions from his eastern campaigns, in the center. His weaker Italian recruits held the right wing, protected by rough ground that would prevent cavalry attacks. On his left, he massed his powerful cavalry force, supported by archers and slingers from across the eastern Mediterranean. The strategy was sound. Use the cavalry to crush Caesar's right wing, then roll up his entire line from the flank. With superior numbers and positioning, Pompey expected a decisive victory that would end the civil war before sunset. Caesar's deployment revealed the tactical genius that had made him master of Gaul. Understanding that his smaller force couldn't match Pompey's frontage, he formed his legions deeper than usual, creating a powerful striking force that could punch through enemy lines. His veteran 10th Legion anchored the right wing, while the reliable 8th and 9th Legions held the center. But Caesar's masterstroke was invisible to Pompey's observers. Behind his main battle line, Caesar positioned 6 cohorts, about 3,000 of his best soldiers, as a hidden reserve. These men would wait concealed until Pompey's cavalry charge revealed itself, then strike at the perfect moment to turn victory into disaster. "Today," Caesar told his officers, "we end this war. not through mercy or negotiation, but through the courage of Roman soldiers fighting for Rome's future. The battle began at dawn, with the traditional exchange of javelins. Thousands of iron-tipped pila arced through the morning air, their points designed to bend on impact and make shields useless. The sound was like thunder rolling across the plain, 20,000 men shouting war cries in a dozen languages. Then came the charge. Pompey's infantry advanced in perfect formation, their shields locked, their swords gleaming in the early sunlight. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of Eastern campaigns, confident in their numbers and their cause. Behind them, the aristocrats of Rome watched from horseback, already composing the victory dispatches they would send to their estates. Caesar's legions met them head-on with the fury that had broken Celtic tribes from the Atlantic to the Rhine. The clash when the lines met could be heard for miles, the crash of shield on shield, the scrape of iron on iron, the screams of wounded men calling for their mothers in their final moments. For an hour, neither side could gain advantage. Roman discipline fought Roman discipline, veteran experience matched veteran experience. Men who had once shared the same camps and marched under the same standards now thrust swords at each other's throats with professional efficiency. But gradually, Caesar's tactical superiority began to tell. His deeper formations could rotate fresh men to the front more easily. His veterans, hardened by years of Gallic warfare, showed slightly better endurance. Most importantly, his soldiers fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that defeat meant death or exile. Pompey's cavalry charge came precisely when Caesar had predicted. 7,000 horsemen thundered across the plain, their colorful banners streaming behind them, their war cries echoing off the distant mountains. Leading them were the flower of Eastern nobility, Galatian princes who traced their ancestry to Alexander's companions, Thracian chieftains whose fathers had fought Rome itself. They struck Caesar's cavalry with overwhelming force, scattering the outnumbered Romans like leaves before a storm. The way to Caesar's rear lay open, victory seemingly within Pompey's grasp. But as the Eastern cavalry wheeled to attack Caesar's exposed flank, they rode directly into the trap he had prepared. The 6 cohorts Caesar had kept hidden rose from concealment like ghosts materializing from the earth. Instead of meeting cavalry with cavalry, Caesar met them with disciplined infantry armed with javelins and trained to kill horses as efficiently as men. The result was carnage. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the dust. Noble princes who had never fled from battle found themselves running for their lives, their elaborate armor no protection against Roman iron wielded by men who had killed professionally for years. With his cavalry destroyed, Pompey's entire left flank collapsed. Caesar's hidden reserve, having shattered the horsemen, now fell on the exposed flank of Pompey's infantry. What had been an organized battle line became a desperate struggle for survival. "The day is ours," Caesar's centurions shouted, their voices carrying over the din of battle. "Push them, break them for Rome and Caesar." But even as victory became certain, Caesar maintained the strategic vision that separated him from other commanders. Instead of allowing his men to pursue and slaughter their enemies, he sent messengers racing through the ranks with orders that would echo through history. "Spare the Romans!" It was a command that saved thousands of lives and won Caesar thousands of future allies. Roman soldiers who expected death received mercy. Senators who had opposed Caesar found themselves pardoned and even welcomed back into public life. It was clemency on a scale unprecedented in civil war, and it served both Caesar's genuine desire to heal Rome's wounds and his practical need to govern a unified empire. Pompey himself fled the field as his army disintegrated around him. The man who had conquered the East, who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, who had reorganized entire regions of the known world, rode away from Pharsalus with only a handful of companions, his reputation in ruins and his cause apparently lost. Behind him lay 15,000 of his soldiers, not all dead, For Caesar's mercy had saved many, but defeated, scattered, and demoralized. The eagles of his legions, symbols of Roman power and pride, now belonged to Caesar. The treasury that had funded his great army was captured intact, providing Caesar with the resources he needed to complete his victory. But perhaps most significantly, the myth of Pompey's invincibility was broken forever. For 30 years, he had been Rome's greatest general, the man who never lost a battle, the conqueror who extended Roman power farther than any before him. Now he was just another exile, dependent on the charity of foreign kings and the fading memory of past glories. As the sun set over Pharsalus, Caesar walked among the dead, his face grave with the recognition of what this victory meant. He had won more than a battle. He had won the Roman world. But he had also presided over a slaughter of Romans by Romans that violated everything the Republic was supposed to represent. On this day, he reportedly told his staff, and they forced me to this. Even with all my victories, I would have been condemned if I had not sought the aid of my army. It was both justification and lament. Caesar claiming that his enemies' intransigence had made civil war inevitable, while acknowledging the terrible price of his ambition. The Battle of Pharsalus was over. The fate of Pompey and the final act of this great drama still lay ahead. The aftermath of Pharsalus transformed Caesar from rebel general into master of the Roman world. But victory brought new challenges that tested his political wisdom as much as his military genius. Rome's civil war was won, but the Roman world still seethed with potential rebellion. And one of history's greatest generals remained at large with the capacity to inspire resistance across the Mediterranean. Pompey's flight from Pharsalus was both strategic retreat and personal catastrophe. The man who had reorganized the Eastern Mediterranean now found himself dependent on the loyalty of client kings and the fading memory of past favors. His immediate destination was Lesbos, where his wife Cornelia and son Sextus waited in desperate anxiety for news of the battle. The reunion was heartbreaking for those who witnessed it. Cornelia, one of the most cultured women of her generation, had married Pompey in his moment of greatest triumph. Now she watched her husband, aged beyond his 60 years, struggle with the reality of total defeat. Sextus, barely 20 and raised on stories of his father's invincible genius, couldn't comprehend how the family's fortune had collapsed so completely. "What do we do now?" Sextus asked, his voice carrying the bewilderment of youth confronting an incomprehensible disaster. Pompey's answer revealed both his strategic thinking and his fundamental misunderstanding of how completely the world had changed. "We go to Egypt," he said. "Ptolemy owes me everything. I placed him on his throne. I protected him from his enemies. I guaranteed his kingdom's independence. He will provide us with the resources to continue the fight." It was logical reasoning based on traditional Roman relationships, but it failed to account for the brutal realities of international politics. Client kings and dependent rulers had survived for centuries by reading the winds of Roman power accurately. After Pharsalus, those winds blew strongly in Caesar's direction. Meanwhile, Caesar faced the immediate challenge of converting military victory into stable political control. His clemency toward captured enemies had won him widespread admiration. But clemency alone couldn't solve the fundamental problems that had caused the civil war. Rome's constitution was still broken, the army still commanded more loyalty than civilian institutions, and the empire still required extraordinary individuals to govern territories too vast for traditional republican methods. Caesar's first priority was pursuing Pompey, not from vindictiveness but from political necessity. As long as Pompey remained free, he remained a potential rallying point for everyone who opposed Caesar's rise to power. Living former consuls had started civil wars before. Pompey's reputation and connections made him particularly dangerous if given time to organize resistance. The chase across the Mediterranean became a race between Caesar's speed and Pompey's desperation. Caesar commandeered ships at Dyrrhachium, leaving his main army under Mark Antony's command while he sailed eastward with just a few legions. It was characteristically bold, Caesar risking everything on a personal pursuit of his greatest rival. Pompey reached Egypt first, but the welcome he received shattered his remaining illusions about his place in the post-Pharsalus world. The Egyptian court was divided between the young Ptolemy XIII and his sister wife Cleopatra VII, both seeking Roman support in their dynastic struggle. Ptolemy's advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the rhetoric teacher Theodotus, saw Pompey's arrival as either a golden opportunity or a deadly trap. The debate in Alexandria revealed the cold calculations that governed relations between Rome and its clients. Some argued that Egypt should support Pompey, gambling that he could still recover his position and reward those who had remained loyal. Others pointed out that harboring Caesar's enemy would invite invasion and destruction. Theodotus, whose Greek education had taught him to value practical wisdom above sentimental loyalty, made the argument that would determine Pompey's fate. "Dead men don't bite," he reportedly said. "If we support Pompey and he loses, Caesar will destroy us. If we turn him away and Caesar discovers we refused his enemy's sanctuary, Caesar will still destroy us. But if we kill Pompey ourselves, we prove our loyalty to Caesar while eliminating the threat he represents." It was realpolitik at its most ruthless, but it reflected the harsh realities of a world where Roman civil wars had global consequences. When Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast near Alexandria on September 28, 48 BCE, a small boat emerged from the harbor flying Ptolemaic banners. On board were Achilles, the Egyptian army commander, and 2 Roman officers who had once served under Pompey, Septimius and Salvius. Pompey recognized Septimius immediately. The man had served with distinction during the Eastern campaigns, earning promotions through courage and competence. His presence on the Egyptian boat suggested that old loyalties still held, that sanctuary and perhaps even military support might be available. "Oh, Salvius, my old friend," Pompey called out as the boats drew alongside each other. "I never expected to see you in Egyptian service." Septimius' reply was carefully neutral, designed to lure Pompey within striking distance without arousing suspicion. "Times change, General. Come aboard, and we'll discuss what support Egypt can provide." As Pompey stepped from his ship onto the smaller boat, Cornelia watched from the deck with growing unease. Something about the Egyptian's manner suggested deception, but it was too late to voice her concerns. The boat carrying her husband was already pulling away toward shore. What happened next took less than a minute, but changed the course of world history. As Pompey bent forward to greet Achilles with traditional Roman courtesy, Septimius drew his sword and struck from behind. The blade caught Pompey in the back, between his shoulder blades, piercing his heart with the precision of a professional soldier. Pompey the Great, conqueror of 3 continents, organizer of the East, the general who had never lost a battle until Pharsalus died in the bilge water of an Egyptian fishing boat, killed by men who had once sworn to follow him to death. From her ship, Cornelia watched her husband murdered with the cold efficiency that marked all Egyptian politics. Her screams of horror and rage carried across the water, but there was nothing she could do except order her captain to flee before the Egyptians decided that Pompey's family posed additional threats to their security. The news of Pompey's assassination reached Caesar 3 days later, as he approached Alexandria with fewer than 4,000 soldiers. The messenger sent by Ptolemy's court carried with him Pompey's severed head and signet ring as proof of Egypt's loyalty to the new master of the Roman world. Caesar's reaction was not what the Egyptians expected. Instead of gratitude for their decisive action, Caesar reportedly wept when he saw his old friend and rival reduced to a grisly trophy. Whether his tears were genuine grief or calculated theater, they reflected his understanding that Pompey's murder created new problems even as it solved old ones. "They have robbed me of the chance to show mercy to a great Roman," Caesar told his staff. It was both political statement and personal truth. Caesar had planned to pardon Pompey as he had pardoned so many others, demonstrating his magnanimity while neutralizing opposition through generosity rather than fear. More practically, Pompey's murder denied Caesar the legitimacy that would have come from his rival's voluntary submission. A living Pompey acknowledging Caesar's supremacy would have been worth more than a dozen military victories in convincing Romans that the civil war was truly over. The Egyptian court's celebration of their successful betrayal turned to horror when Caesar made his displeasure clear. Instead of the gratitude and rewards they expected, they faced the cold fury of a man who understood that today's expedient murderers might become tomorrow's threats to his own security. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria also brought him face to face with Cleopatra VII, the 21-year-old queen whose intelligence, ambition, and charm would make her one of the most famous women in history. Their first meeting became the stuff of legend. Cleopatra smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet, dramatically revealing herself to the man who now controlled her kingdom's fate. But behind the romantic drama lay harsh political calculations. Cleopatra needed Roman protection to secure her throne against her brother and his advisors. Caesar needed Egyptian wealth and grain to supply his armies and feed Rome's population. Their alliance, which would soon become a passionate love affair, began as a practical arrangement between two rulers who understood that personal relationships and political necessities were inseparable. The Egyptian intervention transformed what had begun as a brief pursuit into a complex war that would last months. Ptolemy Thonius' advisors, realizing that Caesar's displeasure threatened their lives, organized resistance that turned Alexandria into a battlefield. Caesar found himself besieged in the palace quarter with fewer than 5,000 men, facing an Egyptian army that numbered in the tens of thousands. The Alexandrine War tested Caesar's military skills in ways that even the Gallic campaigns hadn't. Urban warfare required different tactics from open field battles. Caesar's men fought from rooftop to rooftop, using their engineering skills to turn the palace complex into an impregnable fortress, while Egyptian forces tried to starve them into submission. The most dramatic moment came when Egyptian forces attempted to cut off Caesar's water supply by poisoning the palace wells. Caesar responded with characteristic audacity, ordering his men to dig new wells, while launching a night attack that captured the Egyptian fleet in Alexandria's harbor. The captured ships not only provided Caesar with control of the waterfront, but also allowed him to signal Roman reinforcements approaching from Asia Minor. When relief forces finally reached Alexandria in March 47 BCE, they found Caesar firmly in control of Egypt and deeply involved with its queen. The political implications were staggering. Rome's most powerful general had formed an alliance with the world's richest kingdom, sealed by a personal relationship that would produce a son and reshape Mediterranean politics. But Caesar's Egyptian adventure also demonstrated the limitations of even the most brilliant leadership. While he had been fighting for his life in Alexandria, opposition to his rule had been growing throughout the Roman world. In Asia Minor, Pharnaces the Secu of Pontus, son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, had invaded Roman territory, confident that Caesar was too distracted to respond effectively. In Africa, a coalition of Pompeian survivors and Republican diehards was assembling another army, supported by King Juba of Numidia, and funded by those who refused to accept Caesar's victory as final. Cato the Younger, the moral conscience of the dying republic, had assumed leadership of this resistance, his reputation for integrity attracting those who saw continued opposition as a sacred duty. Most dangerously, in Rome itself, Caesar's prolonged absence had created a power vacuum that threatened to undermine everything he had achieved. Mark Antony, left in charge as Caesar's representative, was proving inadequate to the complex task of managing Roman politics. His heavy drinking, sexual scandals, and erratic decision-making were alienating potential allies and providing ammunition for Caesar's enemies. As Caesar prepared to leave Egypt in the summer of 47 BCE, He understood that his victory at Pharsalus had been only the beginning. The Roman world was too vast, too complex, and too fractured to be controlled by military victory alone. He needed to demonstrate that he could govern as brilliantly as he could fight, that his rule would bring peace and prosperity rather than chaos and oppression. The test would come soon enough. But first, Caesar had to deal with Pharnaces and his invasion of Roman Asia, a campaign that would produce perhaps the most famous 3 words in military history. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The 5-day campaign against Pharnaces at Zela revealed Caesar at the peak of his powers, a general so confident in his abilities that he could afford to joke about them. When news of the lightning victory reached Rome, Caesar's dispatch to the Senate contained only those 3 immortal words: Veni, vidi, vici. It was military efficiency reduced to its purest essence, and it announced to the world that Caesar's brief distraction in Egypt had cost him none of his legendary speed or decisiveness. But even as Caesar celebrated this latest triumph, the forces that would ultimately destroy him were already gathering strength. His very success was creating the conditions for his downfall, as Romans who had accepted his rule as a temporary necessity began to fear it might become permanent tyranny. The opposition that assembled in North Africa represented the last hope of the Roman Republic, as it had existed for 5 centuries. Marcus Porcius Cato, great-grandson of Cato the Censor, emerged as the moral leader of this final resistance. Unlike the ambitious generals who had fought Caesar for personal power, Cato fought for an idea: the notion that Rome should be governed by laws rather than men, by institutions rather than individuals. Cato's reputation for integrity was legendary throughout the Roman world. He walked through Rome's streets in a black toga, refusing the luxuries that other senators considered necessities. He never took bribes, never bent rules for personal advantage, never compromised his principles for political gain. To his supporters, he was the conscience of Rome. To his critics, he was an inflexible idealist whose rigid morality made practical governance impossible. "I better to die free than live as slaves," Cato told his fellow senators as they organized resistance in the African city of Utica. "Caesar may offer us pardons, but pardons imply guilt. We have committed no crime except defending the republic our ancestors bequeathed to us." The African coalition assembled impressive forces. Marcus Scipio, descendant of the family that had defeated Hannibal, commanded Republican legions that had escaped from Greece. King Juba of Numidia provided cavalry and local troops, along with elephants that had been Rome's nightmare since the Punic Wars. Most importantly, the rebels controlled territory rich enough to fund extended resistance against Caesar's growing empire. But the coalition suffered from the same weaknesses that had plagued Pompey's cause. Their commanders were more concerned with maintaining Republican traditions than winning battles. Their troops included many reluctant conscripts and foreign auxiliaries whose loyalty was questionable. Most critically, they faced an enemy whose military genius had been proven in a dozen campaigns across 3 continents. Caesar's African campaign began in December 47 BCE, with another of his calculated risks. Instead of waiting for ideal conditions, he sailed from Sicily in winter storms that scattered his fleet and separated him from most of his supplies. He landed on the African coast with fewer than 10,000 men, facing an enemy army 3 times that size in unfamiliar territory. The early weeks of the campaign went badly for Caesar. His scattered forces couldn't concentrate effectively against Scipio's superior numbers. Local populations, influenced by Cato's reputation and fearful of Caesar's known ruthlessness toward cities that resisted him, provided intelligence and supplies to the Republican forces. Most troubling for Caesar's veterans, they found themselves facing elephants for the first time in their careers. These massive creatures, armored and carrying towers full of archers, had terrorized Roman armies for generations. At the Battle of Ruspina, Republican cavalry and elephant charges came close to achieving the decisive victory that had eluded Pompey at Pharsalus. But Caesar's response to adversity revealed the qualities that made him truly exceptional. Instead of retreating or seeking reinforcements, he used the winter months to train his legions in anti-elephant tactics. Roman engineers developed new javelin designs specifically for killing the massive beasts. Caesar himself studied elephant behavior, learning how to turn their size and weight against them. When the decisive battle came at Thapsus in April 46 BCE, Caesar was ready. His legions, formed in deeper ranks than usual, met the elephant charge with coordinated javelin volleys that targeted the animals' eyes and trunks. Wounded elephants, maddened by pain, turned and trampled their own troops. What had been Scipio's greatest advantage became the instrument of his defeat. The collapse of Republican resistance in Africa was swift and total. Scipio died in battle, preferring death to the humiliation of surrender. King Juba, faced with inevitable capture, arranged a mutual suicide pact with his Roman ally Petreius, each man killing the other in a final gesture of defiance. But the most significant death was Cato's. When news of Thapsus reached Utica, the moral leader of Republican resistance faced a choice that would define his historical legacy. Caesar had made clear that he would show his usual clemency to surrendering enemies. Cato could live, accept a pardon, and perhaps even return to public life under the new regime. Instead, Cato chose to die on his own terms rather than accept life as Caesar's subject. On the night of April 12, 46 BCE, he spent his final hours reading Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul. Then, with the calm deliberation that had marked his entire life, Cato the Younger fell on his sword, dying as the last true representative of the Roman Republic. News of Cato's suicide struck Caesar like a physical blow. "Cato, I begrudge you your death as you begrudged me your life," he reportedly said when he learned of his enemy's final act. It was both tribute and lament, recognition that Cato's principled opposition had given moral weight to the Republican cause, and regret that such integrity could find no place in Caesar's new order. Cato's death transformed him from political opponent into martyr for Republican ideals. His suicide became a rallying cry for everyone who believed that some things were more important than life itself, that freedom, dignity, and principle were worth dying for. In death, Cato achieved a moral victory that had eluded him in life, becoming the symbol of everything that Caesar's rise to power had destroyed. Caesar returned to Rome in the summer of 46 BCE to celebrate 4 triumphs simultaneously. For his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa. The spectacles were unprecedented in their magnificence, designed to demonstrate both Caesar's military genius and the wealth that his conquests had brought to Rome. For 4 days, the Roman people watched captive kings walk in chains through their streets. They marveled at displays of captured treasure that exceeded the combined wealth of previous generations. They cheered as Caesar's veterans received bonuses that made them rich beyond their wildest dreams. They gasped at exotic animals from the edges of the known world, giraffes from Africa, tigers from India, and creatures so strange that Romans lacked names for them. But beneath the celebration lay tensions that no amount of spectacle could resolve. Caesar's continuous absence from Rome had allowed problems to fester that required immediate attention. The city's population had swollen beyond sustainable limits as displaced farmers and unemployed citizens flocked to the capital seeking opportunities. Housing was inadequate, sanitation was breaking down, and social tensions were reaching dangerous levels. More fundamentally, Romans were beginning to grapple with what Caesar's victory actually meant for their future. The Republic was officially still functioning. Caesar held traditional magistracies and consulted with the Senate on important matters. But everyone understood that real power lay with the man who commanded the legions, controlled the treasury, and could make or break careers with a word. Caesar's reforms during this period revealed both his administrative genius and his determination to reshape Roman society according to his vision. He expanded citizenship to inhabitants of Gaul and Spain, recognizing that the empire's strength lay in incorporating new peoples rather than simply exploiting them. He reformed the calendar, creating the system that still governs our lives today. He launched massive public works projects that provided employment for Rome's poor while beautifying the capital. Most controversially, Caesar began planning new colonies for his veterans and Rome's surplus population. These settlements, stretching from Spain to Asia Minor, would spread Roman culture throughout the Mediterranean world, while creating loyal populations that owed their prosperity to Caesar's generosity. But Caesar's most significant reform was one he never officially announced: the transformation of Rome from republic to monarchy. He accumulated offices and honors that placed him above traditional limitations. He appointed magistrates rather than allowing free elections. He made policy decisions that previous consuls would have debated with the Senate for months. The process was gradual and carefully managed, designed to avoid provoking the kind of opposition that had destroyed earlier would-be kings. But perceptive observers understood that they were witnessing the end of the Republic and the birth of something entirely new. A system where one man's will would determine the fate of millions. Opposition to Caesar's growing power took forms both subtle and direct. In the Senate, elderly Republicans like Cicero delivered speeches that praised Caesar's achievements while lamenting the changes he had brought to traditional Roman government. Their words were carefully chosen to avoid direct confrontation, but their meaning was clear to anyone who understood Roman political language. More dangerous was the opposition that remained hidden, festering in the hearts of men who had accepted Caesar's clemency but never forgiven his victory. These were senators and magistrates who attended Caesar's receptions, voted for his proposals, and publicly praised his wisdom while privately plotting his destruction. Marcus Junius Brutus epitomized this hidden opposition. Descended from the founder of the Republic, pardoned by Caesar after Pharsalus, honored with high office and personal friendship, Brutus nevertheless burned with resentment at Rome's transformation. His ancestor had expelled the last king. Perhaps he was destined to remove the next one. As 45 BCE dawned, Caesar faced one final challenge to his authority. In Spain, Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had assembled yet another republican army, supported by Spanish tribes that had never fully accepted Roman rule. It would be Caesar's last campaign, and in many ways his most difficult. The Spanish War differed from Caesar's previous conflicts because his enemies fought with the same tactics and discipline that had made him famous. Pompey's sons had learned from their father's mistakes, avoiding pitched battles while using guerrilla warfare and local knowledge to offset Caesar's advantages. The campaign culminated at Munda in March 45 BCE, in a battle that Caesar later admitted was the closest he ever came to defeat. For hours, the outcome remained in doubt as veteran forces fought with a desperation that impressed even Caesar's hardened legions. Only a personal charge by Caesar himself, fighting in the front ranks like a common soldier, finally broke the Republican resistance. With Munda, the last organized opposition to Caesar's rule, was crushed. Gnaeus Pompey died in the fighting, while Sextus escaped to become a pirate leader who would plague the Mediterranean for years to come. But the immediate threat was over. Caesar was finally indisputably master of the entire Roman world. Yet even as Caesar achieved absolute victory, the forces that would destroy him were gathering in the marble halls of Rome itself. Success had made him careless of his safety, contemptuous of his enemies, and blind to the hatred that his clemency had failed to extinguish. The Ides of March were approaching, and with them the final act of Julius Caesar's extraordinary life. The assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15, 44 BCE, was intended to restore the Roman Republic and return power to the Senate and people of Rome. Instead, it triggered a series of civil wars that would rage for 13 more years, and ultimately establish an imperial system more absolute than anything Caesar himself had envisioned. In trying to kill a tyrant, the conspirators had created the conditions for tyranny on a scale the ancient world had never seen. The irony was perfect and terrible. Caesar's death accomplished what his life had failed to achieve: the complete destruction of republican government and the birth of an empire that would dominate the Western world for over a millennium. Marcus Junius Brutus, the most reluctant of the assassins, embodied the tragic contradiction at the heart of the conspiracy. Descended from the founder of the Republic, raised on stories of ancestors who had died defending Roman liberty, Brutus genuinely believed that killing Caesar would restore the constitutional government that had made Rome great. His last words, "I have not lived in vain," reflected his conviction that tyrannicide was the highest form of patriotism. But Brutus and his co-conspirators fundamentally misunderstood the world they lived in. The Republic hadn't died because Caesar killed it. Caesar had risen to power because the Republic was already dying from contradictions and pressures that no amount of noble sentiment could resolve. The empire was too large, the army too professional, the wealth too concentrated, and the population too diverse for the government designed for a city-state to function effectively. Caesar's heir and eventual successor, his grandnephew Octavian, understood this reality far better than Caesar's assassins ever did. Where Caesar had maintained the fiction that he was simply a Roman magistrate with extraordinary powers, Octavian would openly transform himself into Augustus, the first Roman emperor, ruling through institutions designed for imperial rather than republican government. The comparison between Caesar and Augustus reveals the full significance of the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Caesar was the last of the republican strongmen, brilliant, charismatic, and personally dominant, but still operating within traditional Roman categories. Augustus was the first of the imperial autocrats, carefully bureaucratic, systematically thorough, and institutionally innovative. Caesar's most important legacy wasn't his military conquests or his political reforms, but his demonstration that the Roman Republic could no longer contain the forces unleashed by its own success. His crossing of the Rubicon didn't just start a civil war. It marked the moment when Rome acknowledged that its traditional constitution was inadequate for governing a world empire. The military implications of Caesar's career echoed through centuries of warfare. His tactical innovations, the use of reserves, the integration of engineering with combat operations, the emphasis on speed and surprise over numerical superiority, became standard practice for armies throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. More importantly, his transformation of soldiers' loyalty from the state to their commander established a pattern that would define military relationships for the rest of Roman history. But Caesar's political legacy was even more profound. His clemency toward defeated enemies, unprecedented in Roman civil war, established a new model for how victorious factions might consolidate power without destroying the very populations they sought to rule. His extension of citizenship to conquered peoples pointed toward a more inclusive definition of what it meant to be Roman. His massive public works projects demonstrated how government could actively shape society, rather than simply maintaining existing structures. Perhaps most significantly, Caesar's career illustrated both the possibilities and the dangers of exceptional leadership in complex societies. His intelligence, energy, and vision accomplished things that seemed impossible. Conquering Gaul, crossing the Rubicon, defeating Pompey, reorganizing the Mediterranean world. But his very exceptionalism made him a threat to any system based on shared power and institutional constraints. The philosophical implications of Caesar's rise fascinated ancient thinkers and continue to challenge modern ones. The Stoics, particularly those influenced by Cato's example, saw Caesar as the embodiment of ambition unchecked by virtue, a cautionary tale about what happened when personal desire overcame duty to the common good. Later historians like Tacitus viewed him as a necessary evil, a strongman whose illegal actions were justified by the corruption and paralysis of the system he destroyed. Modern scholars continue to debate whether Caesar was a visionary reformer whose assassination prevented beneficial changes, or a ruthless autocrat whose death came too late to save republican government. The evidence supports both interpretations, suggesting that Caesar himself was a more complex figure than either his admirers or his critics typically acknowledge. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra also had lasting consequences that extended far beyond their personal connection. Their alliance demonstrated how Roman civil wars had become global conflicts, involving kingdoms and peoples across 3 continents. Their son Caesarion represented a potential fusion of Roman and Egyptian power that might have reshaped the entire Mediterranean world, until Augustus had him quietly murdered to eliminate any rival claims to Caesar's legacy. The cultural impact of Caesar's career is impossible to calculate fully. His name became synonymous with absolute power in languages across Europe and beyond: Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian, Caesar in English. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars remain required reading in military academies and Latin classrooms. His speeches, though lost, were praised by Cicero as examples of perfect eloquence. His reforms of the calendar still govern our daily lives, but perhaps Caesar's most important contribution to human civilization was his demonstration that political and military genius, however brilliant, cannot solve fundamental structural problems through force of personality alone. The Roman Republic died not because Caesar killed it, but because it had become incompatible with the realities of governing a world empire populated by diverse peoples with different traditions and needs. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey thus represents more than a struggle between 2 ambitious men. It was the death throes of one form of government and the birth pangs of another. The republic that emerged from the Punic Wars and conquered the Mediterranean couldn't survive its own success. The empire that replaced it, despite its many flaws and eventual collapse, provided a model of centralized government that influenced political development for centuries. The parallels between Caesar's Rome and modern political systems are both illuminating and troubling. Like contemporary democracies, the Roman Republic struggled with the tension between popular will and institutional constraints. Like modern nations, Rome discovered that military success abroad could undermine constitutional government at home. Like today's politicians, Roman leaders found that the tools necessary for governing an empire often conflicted with the principles that had created their system in the first place. Caesar's use of propaganda, his cultivation of popular support against traditional elites, his willingness to break constitutional norms in the name of emergency action, all these tactics have modern echoes that make his story uncomfortably relevant. His argument that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures has been used by leaders throughout history to justify the accumulation of power that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But Caesar's story also demonstrates the importance of institutional resilience and the danger of allowing any individual, however capable, to become indispensable to the functioning of government. The Roman Republic's failure to develop mechanisms for peaceful transition of power among competing elites created the conditions that made civil war inevitable. Their inability to adapt traditional institutions to imperial realities opened the door for strongmen who promised stability at the cost of freedom. Perhaps most importantly, the conflict between Caesar and Pompey illustrates the human cost of political failure. The civil wars that began with the crossing of the Rubicon killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed countless communities, and traumatized an entire generation. The Republic's collapse wasn't just a political event, it was a human catastrophe that affected millions of lives across the ancient world. Yet from this destruction emerged institutions and ideas that shaped Western civilization for millennia. Roman law, refined during the imperial period, became the foundation of legal systems throughout Europe and beyond. Roman engineering techniques, perfected to serve imperial needs, created infrastructure that lasted for centuries. Roman administrative methods developed to govern diverse populations provided models for later empires and nation-states. The Latin language that Caesar spoke with such eloquence evolved into the Romance languages that hundreds of millions of people speak today. The literature he inspired, from Virgil's Aeneid to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, continues to move and educate readers across the globe. The historical methods he pioneered in his commentaries influenced how we understand and record human events. Most profoundly, the questions that Caesar's career raised about power, liberty, order, and justice remain central to political discourse in every era. How much individual freedom should be sacrificed for collective security? When do emergency measures become permanent tyranny? Can democratic institutions survive in a world of global responsibilities and instant communication? These are Caesar's questions, and we are still struggling to answer them. The Stoic philosophers who lived through Rome's transformation from republic to empire developed insights about resilience, duty, and acceptance that speak directly to modern anxieties about political and social change. Marcus Aurelius, writing 2 centuries after Caesar's death, reflected on the impermanence of all human institutions and the importance of maintaining personal integrity regardless of external circumstances. His meditations, composed in the shadow of Caesar's legacy, remain one of the most influential works of practical philosophy ever written. "Remember that very little disturbs the universe," Aurelius wrote, "and that which disturbs it for a moment is restored in a moment too." It was a lesson born from Rome's experience of civil war and imperial transformation. The understanding that even the most dramatic political changes are temporary when measured against the full span of human history. This perspective doesn't minimize the importance of Caesar's career or the significance of the Roman Republic's collapse. Rather, it places these events within a larger framework that helps us understand both their immediate impact and their enduring relevance. Caesar changed the world, but the world continued to change after him. The empire he helped create eventually fell, but the ideas and institutions it generated survived in new forms. The ultimate lesson of Caesar's conflict with Pompey may be that political systems, like biological organisms, must adapt or die. The Roman Republic, for all its achievements, proved unable to evolve quickly enough to meet the challenges of governing a world empire. Caesar's rise to power was both symptom and cause of this failure, evidence that the old system wasn't working, but also the catalyst that made reform impossible and revolution inevitable. Today, as we face our own challenges of global governance, technological disruption, and social transformation, Caesar's story reminds us that no political system, however successful, is permanent. The institutions that serve one era may become obstacles in the next. The leaders who solve yesterday's problems may create tomorrow's crises. The choices we make in moments of crisis echo through generations we will never see. Standing at our own metaphorical Rubicon, facing decisions about democracy and authoritarianism, nationalism and globalism, individual freedom and collective responsibility, we can learn from Caesar's example without repeating his mistakes. His genius was real, but so was his ruthlessness. His achievements were lasting, but so was the damage he caused. His story inspires us, but it should also warn us about the price of political failure and the fragility of constitutional government. The Roman Republic died so that Caesar might live forever in human memory. Whether that was a fair trade remains one of history's most haunting questions. But as we stand in the long shadow that Caesar's career casts across the centuries, we can at least appreciate the magnitude of what was lost and gained when one man chose to cross a small river in northern Italy and change the world forever. The echoes of that decision still reverberate today, reminding us that individual choices made in moments of crisis can reshape the destiny of entire civilizations. Caesar's legacy is not just the empire he helped create, but the eternal question he posed about the relationship between power and responsibility, ambition and duty, the individual and the state. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson we can draw from the greatest civil war of the ancient world. That the choices we make in our own times of crisis will be judged not just by their immediate consequences, but by their impact on the generations who inherit the world we leave behind. As we conclude this journey through one of history's most pivotal conflicts, consider these questions that get to the heart of what makes Caesar and Pompey's story so enduringly relevant. Do you think Rome's transformation from republic to empire was inevitable? Or could different choices by key leaders have preserved democratic government? The evidence suggests both possibilities, making this a question that speaks directly to our own political challenges. Which aspect of Caesar's character do you find most compelling? His military genius that never knew defeat, his political vision that reshaped an entire civilization, or his capacity for mercy that set him apart from other Civil War leaders? Each facet reveals something different about the nature of exceptional leadership and its costs. Looking at the parallels between ancient Rome and modern democracies, what warnings do you see in Caesar's story for contemporary political systems? The similarities are sometimes striking and troubling. Finally, if you could ask Caesar one question about his decision to cross the Rubicon, knowing everything that followed, what would it be? His answer might tell us something important about ambition, responsibility, and the price of changing the world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. History comes alive when we connect these ancient stories to our own experiences and challenges. And if this deep dive into Roman history has sparked your curiosity about other pivotal moments that shaped human civilization, consider subscribing for more explorations of the events, ideas, and personalities that made our world.